To think you know the Ottoman Empire, the grand sultans, the dazzling palaces, the mighty armies that once terrified Europe? Well, buckle up, because the real story behind those golden domes was so much darker than the history books dare to admit. An empire where young girls were stolen from their homes and paraded like treasures in a harem that was less paradise and more prison. A world where soldiers sworn to holiness were broken by humiliations so twisted they turned from protectors into traitors. A court where forbidden games mocked faith itself, turning religion into grotesque theater. You're about to uncover the horrifying sex practices that rotted the empire from within. Rituals so debased they didn't just shame the palace. They ignited a firestorm of rebellion that nearly burned Constantinople to the ground. From the golden chambers of the harem to the blood-soaked streets outside, these are the secrets that will change everything you thought you knew about the Ottomans. Their empire wasn't just collapsing under foreign armies, it was tearing itself apart from the inside. If you're fascinated by the dark truths history tried to bury, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the stories they never wanted you to hear. Women, many of them stolen as children from distant villages, were paraded like treasures. Their lives were stripped of choice the moment they entered the harem. To outsiders, these chambers gleamed with jewels, silks, and song. But inside, the reality was darker. Bodies treated as currency, innocence devoured by ceremonies that blurred the line between worship and degradation. The Sultan's appetite, masked as tradition, became a law that no one dared question. And it wasn't just the harem. The empire's elite guards, the janissaries, soldiers sworn to purity and discipline, were themselves entangled in practices meant to break them. What should have been a brotherhood of warriors turned into a breeding ground of hypocrisy and humiliation. Behind closed doors, loyalty was bought with perversion, obedience demanded through shame. This was not entertainment. It was a system of control, a weaponized theater of desire and fear. For the peasants who toiled under crushing taxes, the knowledge that their leaders feasted on such debauchery became unbearable. The palace that projected divine strength was in truth rotting from within. And soon, that rot would spill into the streets. What began as whispered disgust in coffee houses would ignite into fire, blood, and rebellion. The shocking truth is this: the Ottoman Empire's most horrifying sexual practices did not remain hidden. They lit the fuse for the most shocking rebellion in its history. 2. Behind the harem's golden doors. The harem of the Ottoman palace was the most misunderstood institution in history. To Western travelers, it appeared as an exotic dream: silken cushions, jeweled women, whispered songs echoing through candlelit halls. But the truth behind those gilded doors was brutal. The harem was not a sanctuary of love. It was a machine of power. 2. Behind the harem's golden doors. The harem of the Ottoman palace was the most misunderstood institution in history. To Western travelers, it appeared as an exotic dream: silken cushions, jeweled women, whispered songs echoing through candlelit halls. But the truth behind those gilded doors was brutal. The harem was not a sanctuary of love. It was a machine of power. Hierarchy inside the harem was merciless. The Sultan's favorites lived in luxury, clothed in gold and guarded like diamonds. But thousands more languished in silence, their fates determined by beauty, wit, or sheer luck. For every concubine who rose to the title of Valid Sultan, the mother of a future ruler, hundreds more disappeared into forgotten chambers, never to be seen again. Behind the embroidered curtains, lessons in seduction were drilled as strictly as military training. Girls were taught how to dance, how to smile, how to break a man's will with their eyes. Yet each act was not their own, but dictated by the desires of one man. The harem was not just a collection of women. It was an empire of control, where sex became the highest currency, and pleasure was indistinguishable from enslavement. The glittering palace halls masked a prison. And prisons no matter how gilded, breed resentment. That resentment, whispered in shadows, would one day feed the flames of rebellion. 3. The Janissary paradox, soldiers of faith and depravity. The Janissaries were meant to be the empire's pride. Christian boys taken through the Dev-Shirme system, converted to Islam, and trained to become the Sultan's most loyal soldiers. They were bound by vows of celibacy, discipline, and faith. To the public, they stood as holy warriors. But within their barracks, another story unfolded, a story of abuse disguised as tradition. The same empire that demanded their purity corrupted them with rituals designed to break spirit and body alike. New recruits, often just children, were subjected to humiliations at the hands of older officers. What began as military initiation quickly spiraled into systemic exploitation. Brotherhood, the foundation of their order, was twisted into hierarchy where power was enforced through degradation. By day, they marched in gleaming uniforms, their presence inspiring awe. By night, barracks turned into arenas of cruelty, where loyalty was tested not by valor, but by submission. Soldiers who resisted were beaten or exiled. Those who complied learned quickly that silence was survival. And thus, the very men entrusted with guarding the empire became both victims and perpetrators of a cycle that ate away at their honor. The paradox was devastating. To the outside world, Janissaries represented the might of Islam, defenders of the caliph's throne. Yet internally, they were consumed by practices that mocked the very faith they claimed to uphold. Hypocrisy festered, poisoning morale and planting seeds of hatred not just toward their commanders, but toward the Sultan himself. By the 17th century, this hypocrisy reached a breaking point. The soldiers who should have been the empire's shield became its greatest threat. The same barracks that trained loyalty now bred mutiny, and when they rose in rebellion, it was not simply against bad governance. It was vengeance for years of humiliation hidden beneath the banner of discipline. 4. Forbidden games of the court. The Ottoman court was not only a stage for politics, it was a theater of humiliation dressed as entertainment. Behind the marble walls of Topkapi, performances were devised to amuse the Sultan and his inner circle, but these spectacles were unlike anything seen in civilized society. They blended music, dance, and forced intimacy into grotesque games where consent did not exist. Children were trained like actors, forced to perform before men who cloaked their depravity in the language of art. Women of the harem were commanded to act out elaborate fantasies, some bordering on sacred blasphemy, where religious rituals were parodied as indecent plays. The court called it culture, but to the participants it was degradation paraded as duty. These forbidden games served a darker purpose. They reminded courtiers and officials that their power, no matter how great, ended with the Sultan's pleasure. Even viziers were not immune, drawn into humiliating spectacles that ensured their loyalty through shame. What one could not resist, one could not betray. And so the palace became a carnival of corruption, where amusement was inseparable from domination. But whispers traveled. Servants leaked tales of these obscene entertainments into the streets of Constantinople. Coffee houses buzzed with rumors of sultans who mocked faith, wasted treasure, and indulged in depravity while their people starved. The palace's secret theater became public scandal. And scandal, when mixed with poverty and injustice, is a spark waiting for fire. 5. The psychology of power and submission. The Ottomans understood something chilling. Sex was not just pleasure, it was power. The Sultan wielded intimacy as a political weapon, reducing loyalty to a performance of submission. Within the harem, women were ranked not by merit, but by their ability to satisfy his desires. Within the barracks, soldiers were trained not merely to obey orders, but to surrender dignity. This system created an empire where power meant absolute control over bodies. The Sultan did not simply rule through armies and taxes. He ruled through humiliation. To resist was to lose everything. To submit was to survive. Over time, this conditioning reshaped the psychology of the empire itself. Children torn from families learned early that pleasure could be turned against them. Soldiers discovered that purity was a myth, stripped from them in the name of loyalty. Courtiers realized that intimacy could determine promotions, alliances, even survival. What looked like unity in the empire was in truth a chain of submission forged in fear. Yet every system of control carries its flaw. By teaching the oppressed that desire could be weaponized, the Ottomans unknowingly armed their own enemies. The women of the harem studied their captors as carefully as they entertained them. The janissaries, broken by humiliation, stored their rage like gunpowder. When the moment came, that stored humiliation would detonate into rebellion. The empire's greatest strength, its mastery of psychological control, was also its deadliest weakness. Because those who are taught only submission eventually rise, not to obey, but to destroy. 6. The breaking point. Exploitation meets poverty. By the 17th century, the cracks in the Ottoman Empire could no longer be hidden by silk curtains or golden domes. The people of Constantinople were starving. Heavy taxes crushed peasants, merchants, and craftsmen alike. Grain prices soared while wages shrank. Families sold children into servitude just to survive. Hunger gnawed at every household, and resentment thickened the air like smoke. Yet while ordinary citizens tightened their belts, the palace indulged in decadence. Tales spread of feasts where the Sultan dined on exotic fruits while children starved in the streets outside. The forbidden games of the court, whispered about in taverns and coffee houses, became symbols of everything rotten in the empire. To the people, every rumor of debauchery was another insult, proof that their rulers had abandoned morality for madness. Worse still, the janissaries, once defenders of the empire, were now little better than extortionists. Their salaries stagnated while their humiliation deepened. To make ends meet, they shook down merchants, looted markets, and abused the very people they had sworn to protect. The bond between soldier and citizen, once the backbone of the empire, collapsed into fear and hatred. This was the breaking point, the moment when private indulgence collided with public misery. For centuries, the palace's corruption had been hidden behind high walls, but hunger made those walls transparent. People no longer cared about titles or rituals. They cared about survival. And when survival is threatened, rebellion is inevitable. The streets of Constantinople became cauldrons of anger, boiling with whispers of betrayal. In every marketplace, in every coffee house, the same question rose: why should the people suffer while their rulers drowned in silk and sin? The answer, unspoken but certain, was simple. They would no longer suffer in silence. 7. The spark of rebellion. Rebellion does not erupt overnight. It smolders. For years, resentment against the palace grew, carried in whispers, hidden in songs, passed in coded messages through bazaars and coffee houses. But one event turned whispers into war. The janissaries, once broken by humiliation, finally snapped. The spark came when unpaid wages collided with public disgrace. A group of janissaries stormed into the streets, demanding justice not just for themselves, but for a people long ignored. Their cries were not of loyalty, but of vengeance, and the people listened. For the first time, soldiers and citizens shared the same rage. Rumors of palace debauchery fanned the flames. The Sultan, they said, wasted wealth on dancers and concubines, while plague and hunger ravaged his subjects. Every scandal became a weapon, every story of depravity another reason to rise. Even the most faithful imams began to question how an empire claiming divine authority could be ruled through sin. The rebellion's first act was symbolic and brutal. Coffee houses, once places of gossip, became headquarters of revolution. From there, mobs surged into the streets, carrying not swords, but desperation. Markets shut down, mosques filled with fiery sermons, and the city that once bowed before the Sultan now trembled with defiance. And at the center of it all were the Janissaries, their paradox exposed. Trained to be protectors of the empire, they now marched against it. The same men who had endured humiliation in the barracks led the charge, their rage sharpened by decades of abuse. The empire's greatest warriors had become its greatest threat, and with their revolt, the curtain shielding the palace's secrets was torn away, unleashing a rebellion that would shake Constantinople to its core. 8. Blood in the streets of Constantinople. When rebellion finally erupted, it did not creep. It exploded. Constantinople, the jewel of the empire, became a battlefield overnight. Mobs swarmed the narrow streets, torches blazing against the night sky, their shouts echoing off stone walls. The fury of starving citizens combined with the rage of betrayed soldiers. This was no simple protest. It was vengeance. Palaces were the first targets. The glittering mansions of viziers, once symbols of power, were set ablaze. Flames devoured silks and gold, turning opulence into ash. Courtiers who once strutted in luxury were dragged through the streets, stripped of dignity, beaten, and left to die where beggars once lay hungry. The mosques, once pillars of peace, echoed with sermons that fanned rebellion. Imams thundered against corruption, calling the Sultan's excess a betrayal of Islam itself. Each prayer ended with calls for justice, each call another spark in the firestorm consuming the city. The Janissaries, supposed defenders of order, became the architects of chaos. They stormed through barracks and marketplaces alike, cutting down loyalists and seizing weapons. They led mobs into forbidden quarters of the palace, tearing apart chambers that once hosted forbidden games. For the first time, the people saw the truth of what lay inside. The silks, the jewels, the women held captive. Outrage only deepened. Blood ran through the streets of Constantinople. The air was thick with smoke, the metallic stench of death clinging to every corner. The Sultan's own guards faltered, unsure whether to protect him or join the mob. For an empire built on intimidation, fear now worked against it. The rebellion was unstoppable. The palace of pleasure had become a prison of fire. 9. The fall of innocence. Victims turned executioners. What made this rebellion different was not just its violence, it was its leaders. Many who rose against the Sultan were once victims of the very system they now sought to destroy. Former concubines, abandoned and discarded, whispered secrets that exposed the court's darkest crimes. Former Janissary recruits, scarred by years of humiliation, led mobs with a vengeance sharpened by memory. These were not ordinary rebels. They were survivors of exploitation who had learned cruelty at the hands of the empire itself. And when the time for revenge arrived, they gave back what they had endured, multiplied 1,000-fold. In the burning streets, execution was no longer the Sultan's spectacle. It belonged to the people. Captured officials were forced to kneel before the crowds they had once mocked. Some were hanged from the very gates where peasants once begged for mercy. Others were cut down by mobs chanting curses of betrayal. Each death carried symbolic weight, each act of vengeance a reversal of humiliation. Even the harem, once guarded as sacred, became a site of reckoning. Women who had been trapped within its walls turned on their overseers. Eunuchs, once enforcers of control, were hunted as symbols of oppression. The private playground of the Sultan collapsed into chaos as victims claimed power through blood. The fall of innocence was complete. Those once trained to obey now commanded death. Those once silenced now roared. And in their fury, they showed the empire a truth it could never erase. Oppression breeds monsters, and when those monsters rise, they do not stop until the streets are soaked in justice. 10. Legacy of shame and fire. When the smoke cleared, Constantinople was unrecognizable. Streets once filled with merchants and prayer were scarred with ash. Corpses piled where markets once thrived, and the stench of blood lingered over the city like a curse. The rebellion had ended, but its message burned brighter than the fires that consumed the palace. Corruption had consequences, and no empire, no matter how gilded, could bury its sins forever. The Sultan survived, but not without scars. His authority, once unquestioned, was now fragile. Every whisper in the court carried suspicion. Every loyalist trembled knowing their loyalty had limits. The palace rebuilt its walls, repaired its chambers, and filled its harem anew, but nothing could erase the memory of blood flowing through its gates. For the people, the rebellion was both victory and tragedy. They had struck against tyranny, but at a price of tens of thousands of lives. The city's heart had been ripped open, and the wounds would never fully heal. Coffee houses, once centers of quiet dissent, became monuments of pride, their stories retold with a mixture of horror and defiance. Parents warned their children of the harem's curse, and soldiers carried the memory of betrayal into every new generation. Historians would later debate whether the rebellion changed anything at all. The practices of exploitation did not vanish overnight, nor did the hunger of the empire's rulers. But something fundamental had shifted. The myth of untouchable power had been shattered. The Sultan could no longer pretend to be divinely shielded from the people's wrath. The legacy of this rebellion was not just in fire and blood, but in the echo it left, a warning that empires built on humiliation and indulgence eventually collapse under the weight of their own shame. The Ottoman court's most horrifying secrets had sparked history's most shocking rebellion, and the world would never forget it.